Stay tuned for more weather updates here on the Weather Channel.
Beginning to make landfall with very heavy weather in the Galveston Bay area. We have reports of the Marriott Hotel on Galveston Island being blown apart.
Hurricanes.
Residents across extreme southeast Florida, you should be on the alert.
Each season, an increasing threat to our rapidly growing coastal population.
Recommended evacuation, the beaches and islands in the North Carolina counties.
What can we expect for this season or the next?
As it will continue to cross Long Island into southern New England, very strong hurricane-force winds are existing across southern portions of New England.
On Sunday, August 21st, phone the Weather Channel hurricane expert John Hope, who will answer your questions about hurricanes.
And finally, after the center gets west of New Orleans, the winds are going to come around out of the south and southeast very strong, and we fear that that's when the highest storm surge is going to be.
John Hope on hurricanes.
Coming up next, here on the Weather Channel.
The following is a special presentation of the Weather Channel.
Good evening, I'm John Doyle.
And I'm John Hope.
Tonight we offer a rare opportunity, a chance for our viewers, you, to give John Hope a call. He's our resident expert on hurricanes here at the Weather Channel. For the next hour, he'll share his insight on the origin of hurricanes, how they form, their dangers, and how we monitor these destructive storms of nature. We'll be giving you our toll-free phone number so that you can call and ask your own questions of John Hope, our tropical coordinator here at the Weather Channel. Now, if you are new to the Weather Channel, you may not know John as well as we do, so let me tell you a little bit about him. John is a Phi Beta Kappa scholar and holds a master's degree in meteorology from the University of Chicago. He began his career with the Air Weather Service, then worked with the Spaceflight Meteorology Group in Miami, Florida, and later became the senior hurricane specialist for the National Hurricane Center. Along the way, John has received many honors and awards. In the late 70s, he led the World Meteorological Organization's Pacific Typhoon Committee and Review Session in Southeast Asia, and he represented the United States at the Global Typhoon Conference in Bangkok. 6 years ago, he joined the Weather Channel as our resident hurricane expert, and we are very glad to have him. And I think in your honor today, John, we actually have a couple of depressions on the Atlantic.
We have two out there. We have one in the Caribbean Sea. It's centered about 700 miles east-southeast Kingston, Jamaica. That has not become any better organized during the day. It's moving toward the west pretty fast, but we think it does have some potential. We have another one way out by the Cape Verde Islands. That isn't moving very much. We don't think that will increase much at all in the next 2 or 3 days. I might mention, though, we have a tropical wave about 900 miles east of the Lesser Antilles. That is showing signs of getting organized. We think very likely that will be at least a depression by this time tomorrow.
So we may see a little action yet.
I think so.
Yes. As the month of August draws to a close, we are still in full swing in the hurricane season. Already, several tropical depressions, including those John just mentioned. 2 named storms, Alberto and Beryl, a little earlier. Of course, all these storms, hurricanes or not, pack tremendous power. A full-fledged hurricane has so much power that if we could harness it, it would provide enough electricity to provide power for the whole country for an entire year. But hurricanes do not just happen. It takes a unique combination of elements and just the right timing to create one, as John explains.
Certain basic elements are needed for the development of a hurricane. First, warm ocean waters, at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit, to warm the air at the ocean surface and cause it to rise. This rising air then cools, and as a result, water vapor condenses into clouds and rain, adding more heat to the atmosphere. Next, more warm air from near the ocean surface is drawn in to the newly forming vortex to replace the air that's rising. As the air rushes toward the developing low-pressure center, it moves in spiral paths because of the Earth's rotation until a complete circulation is formed. We call this a tropical depression, and this satellite view shows the crescent-shaped clouds common in these weather patterns. For our storm to continue growing, upper-level winds must again come into play and spiral warm air away from the top of the developing storm. When wind speeds exceed 39 miles per hour, it becomes a tropical storm and is given a name. If the storm continues to build and wind speeds exceed 74 miles per hour, our storm becomes a hurricane. A hurricane's force is gauged by what we call the Saffir-Simpson scale. A Category 1 hurricane means sustained winds between 74 and 95 miles per hour. This is often referred to as a minimal hurricane. Hurricane Danny in 1985 was a Category 1 storm, yet it still wreaked havoc along the Gulf Coast. A Category 2 hurricane carries winds between 96 and 110 miles an hour. About 35 Category 2 storms have struck the United States during this century. A Category 3 hurricane has sustained winds between 111 and 130 miles per hour. Almost 80% of American coastal residents have never experienced a direct hit by a landfalling hurricane Category 3 or higher. Well, look at the damage Category 3 Hurricane Eloise brought to northwest Florida when it made landfall in 1975. Category 4 hurricanes involve wind speeds between 131 and 155 miles per hour. Many structures cannot survive winds like these, and more than 2/3 of the deadliest hurricanes on record were a Category 4 or higher. The final category in the Saffir-Simpson scale is number 5. These are by far the most deadly of hurricanes, with wind speeds in excess of 155 miles per hour. Only 2 Category 5 hurricanes have struck the United States: the Labor Day hurricane in the Florida Keys in 1935 and Hurricane Camille. Winds of this intensity shatter most weather reporting equipment, turn boats and cars into dangerous projectiles, and leave behind overwhelming destruction. Camille came ashore in August of 1969 at Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and crushed over 6,000 dwellings.
Hurricane Camille has been called the most intense hurricane in recent history. Have there been any other storms as violent, John?
Well, of course, we'd have to include the Key storm in 1935, and less violent storms, the ones that killed more people, of course, would have been the Galveston hurricane in 1900, which killed about 6,000. Then we had one off the Georgia and South Carolina islands in 1893, killed 2,000. The worst one, though, in the Western Hemisphere was one that occurred way back in 1780 during the American War of Independence, and that one hit elements of the French and the British fleets very, very hard, in addition to killing all those people. And some historians, anyway, would argue that that hurricane had an effect on the end of the war.
Yes.
Because just a year later, when the Cornwallis was being besieged at Yorktown, the British and the French fleet had blockaded the port. The British couldn't come down there and rescue him because of the losses that they had sustained a year earlier. That plus the fact that it was a hurricane season again, and they would not come down there to try to break the siege.
Yes. Well, let's hope we don't set any more history-making hurricane damage this year anytime soon. Anyway.
Hope not.
We'll be back in just a moment and take a look at some of the destruction that hurricanes can cause, and we'll take your calls at 1-800-541-6056.
Burglary. It seems to be happening everywhere these days, even in neighborhoods like mine. This time it was right next door. That's why I invested in the Home Protector from Black & Decker. It's a professional quality security system that's affordable and gives my home and family reliable protection. These compact entry sensors are wireless and were easy to install on my windows and doors. Other components just plug in, but the protection you get is serious. Any intrusion attempt is met by flashing lamps and piercing sirens that operate even if the controller is destroyed. So, if you'd like to know more about Home Protector, do what I did. Call for this free information package today.
For complete details on the Home Protector from Black & Decker, call 1-800-453-1600. That's 1-800-453-1600. Call today.
The 36-hour forecast. Stay tuned for more weather updates here on the Weather Channel.
Fresh scent Clorox, I say fresh scent Clorox. Fresh scent Clorox bleach, goodness, it smells so good.
Fresh scent, another great Clorox bleach.
Goodness, it smells so good.
Is scrubbing mildew making your shower a chamber of horrors? Spray on Tilex Instant Mildew Stain Remover, and mildew stains vanish with no scrubbing. Try Tilex and escape the torture of scrubbing.
Welcome back to John Hope on Hurricanes. I'm John Doyle. Along with me, John Hope, who'll be taking your questions tonight on hurricanes at 1-800-541-6056. Of course, for many people, the worst hurricane is the one they've just lived through. Although there are many people who live along the coast who will never experience the full force, the full brunt of one of these storms. But hurricanes contain many dangers, and not just along the coast, as John Hope explains.
New Orleans. Its southern Creole beauty is tucked in between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. Like many other coastal population centers, New Orleans is vulnerable to a hurricane landfall. As development increases, so does the population, and so does the danger. A total evacuation here would take more than 72 hours, but no one can provide that much time in a hurricane warning. Instead, the city is protected by an elaborate series of man-made barriers and pumps. According to the Corps of Engineers, these should hold, but no one knows for sure until a major hurricane strikes. The biggest threat to human life in a hurricane comes from the storm surge, a watery villain which is responsible for 9 out of 10 hurricane-related deaths. The storm surge is an enormous wall of water, perhaps 50 miles long, driven shoreward by a landfalling hurricane. Storm surges in the United States have produced water levels of more than 20 feet above normal tidal ranges. Accompanying the storm surge are often massive waves, which scour the coastline and reduce buildings to debris. This photo shows Crescent Beach, Massachusetts, in 1954, before Hurricane Carol. Here is the same location after Carol made landfall. Lines have been drawn from the original building sites to show where the demolished buildings were later found. This is what Hurricane Frederick did to a condominium complex on Gulf Shores, Alabama in 1979. The swimming pool was completely filled with sand. Hurricane Gloria struck the northeast coast in September of 1985. But since landfall came at low tide, only a minimum of storm surge damage resulted. Here is a map of New York City as it looks today, but this is how it would have looked if Gloria had hit at high tide. Much of the city would have been flooded. The next biggest danger in a hurricane is the wind itself. Buildings which might survive 100-mile-per-hour winds would be crumbled under the force of 200-mile-per-hour winds. Even heavy objects like boats and cars can become deadly missiles. Another hurricane danger is rainfall-induced flooding. After Hurricane Camille smashed the Mississippi coast in 1969, the fury of the storm moved inland and led to extensive flooding as far away as Virginia. The combined effects of Camille's storm surge and rainfall-induced flooding claimed 256 lives and destroyed billions of dollars in property. Tornadoes can be another byproduct of hurricanes. The twisters tend to form around the time of a hurricane's landfall, but these are likely to be weaker than their Midwest counterparts and don't last as long. Once a hurricane makes landfall, its energy source is cut off, and the storm begins to die.
The last hurricane to score a direct hit on Miami was Betsy back in 1965. Lives were lost that year, and the damage was estimated in the millions of dollars. But now, John, Miami has grown up quite a bit, 23 years. What would happen if a storm like Betsy were to hit Miami today?
Well, Miami has increased, as you know, by millions and millions of people.
Yes.
You know, they used to say that Miami was due a hurricane once every 7 years, and here it's been more than 20 years since they've had one. So there's been just a tremendous buildup. So the more people you have, the more risk there is, of course, and the more difficult it is to evacuate people and so on. In fact, we have that kind of a situation along the entire coast. If we look at the population, what the population increase has been along the coast compared to the rest of the country, during the 2 decades, we had an increase of about a little over 30%, a little less than 30%, I guess, over the country as a whole. But if you look at the subdivisions and people who live right on the beach, it's increased tremendously. America has a love affair with the beach, and they like to build right on the beach itself. So we have much more property and many, many more people at risk than we had the last time we had a major hurricane.
You sure move into one of those places along the shore at your own risk.
You do. You need to know what the risk is, and you need to be prepared to absorb that.
All right. We are ready to take some calls from you. We have one waiting now from Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Go right ahead for John Hope, please.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, what was the largest storm surge ever documented? And secondly, has anyone ever filmed a major storm surge with a movie camera or a video camera and lived to show it?
First of all, the highest storm surge we ever had in the United States was with Hurricane Camille in 1969. It was almost 25 feet, 24.6 I think it was. And rails were washed off the railroad 20 feet above mean sea level during the Keys storm in 1935. And 1893, we think at Savannah Beach and Hilton Head Island that the tide was also around 20 feet. And the answer to the second part of the question is no, no one has ever been able to get a good photograph of a bona fide storm surge.
Well, the wisdom will out, I suppose.
I think.
Yes, we have another call waiting, this time from Portland, Oregon. Go right ahead, please.
Yes, sir. My question is this. How does a tropical wave differ from the tropical depression you talked about earlier? And if I could, one more, please. Could ozone depletion modify hurricane formation?
Well, first of all, the difference between a wave and a depression is a wave, you do not have a closed circulation. Now, in a wave, east of it, the winds will be from the southeast, west of it, they'll be from the northeast. It won't be closed. But then if you get a rotary circulation, a closed circulation, in other words, if you have east winds north of it, west winds south, south winds to the east of it, and north winds to the west of it, you have a closed circulation, and then it can be classified as a tropical depression. And as far as the ozone depletion, I don't think that we know the answer to that. We can't really say. This is something, of course, that needs to be looked into, but we don't have the answer.
Yeah, a little too early to tell on that one. Right. Next question from Valparaiso, Indiana. Go ahead, please.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My question is, what prevented tropical cyclone development in June and July, and what is the outlook for the rest of the season?
Apparently off to a slow start this year, but statistically, is that really true, John?
Well, you really have two hurricane seasons. You might say June and July, and then you have that part of the season that begins in August.
Yes.
And there's no correlation between what happens in June and July and what happens later on in the season. Usually in June or July, if you do get a storm, it might be at the end of an old front or something like that. But in the July and August, it's not uncommon not to have any in July and August. We average a storm in June every other year and a storm in July every other year. You really get into the peak of the season in August. August is an average of 2, September 3, and October back 2 again. Now, the outlook for the rest of the season, we still believe from what we see that the deep tropics are going to be active. Everything we see leads us to believe that. And this is kind of confirmed right now. We have 2 depressions. I think we're going to have another one pretty soon. Now, we've had 2 storms so far. Some of the predictions have been that we would have a total of 11 this year, where the normal is 9. Now, in order to get that, I think we need to see 3 more storms in August. That would give us 5 in August to have a shot. If we don't see 3 more in August, then I think it will be difficult to have a total of 11. But we still think it's very likely to be active.
So in times past, even though they may have gotten a fewer number at the beginning, they tend to kind of crowd up and it comes all out in the end.
What happens from now, I'd say, through the first 3 weeks in September will determine what kind of a season we have.
All right. Thank you, John. We'll be back and see how hurricane specialists actually track these storms as John Hope on Hurricane continues, and we take your calls at 1-800-541-6056.
$27 years old, and his company was just purchased for $10 million. 34, and she was just made vice president of a well-known bank. 45 and...
Use of our subscribers. Reproduction or other use of this programming without the express written permission of the network is prohibited.
The 36-hour forecast. Weather updates here on the Weather Channel.
John Hope on Hurricanes continues. I'm John Doyle. This is John Hope. John will be taking your questions and phone calls at 1-800-541-6056 tonight. Hurricanes have always fascinated the American public, but prior to World War II, about the only storm observations we had were from ships at sea and island spotters. All that changed in April of 1960 with the launch of our first official weather satellite. And now, hurricane observation techniques have moved into the computer age.
A mature hurricane can involve more than 1 million cubic miles of atmosphere. And thanks to satellite technology, meteorologists can study every detail. Most of the Earth is constantly monitored by an intricate system of satellites. For us, the most vital are the GOES, or geostationary, operational, environmental satellites. Most Atlantic hurricanes develop in the warm waters of the tropics and are picked up by GOES East. This 1979 satellite picture shows Hurricane David moving toward the United States coast, with Hurricane Frederick not far behind. These satellites take photographs every 30 minutes, enabling meteorologists to track a hurricane's exact position. As the storm gets closer to land, reconnaissance aircraft are sent in. These hurricane hunters measure wind speeds, atmospheric pressure, temperature, and humidity within the storm. Then, when the hurricane gets within 200 miles of the United States, it comes under surveillance by one or more of our coastal radars. After a tropical depression forms, the National Hurricane Center in Miami, Florida, begins issuing advisories. A hurricane watch is included when a potential coastal threat is determined, and a hurricane warning is issued when that threat becomes imminent. Hurricane warnings are usually issued about 24 hours before expected landfall. But hurricanes are fickle creatures of nature, and sometimes warnings come with only 12 hours or less lead time.
All residents, please evacuate the area.
These hurricane tracks are examples of the erratic paths which make these storms so difficult to predict. Hurricane Diana appears to be heading safely out to sea in this 1984 satellite view. But watch as it turns abruptly toward shore and aims its violence on the outer banks of North Carolina.
Hurricane advisors, of course, are only about as good as the people who get them. It's up to the individual to make up their own plan of action, what to do in case a hurricane strikes. Like we saw on the radar shots of Diana off the coast of Carolina there. It looked like a sure thing. Heading on in, took a right turn, and here we are. What can we do, John, if we are just about 100% certain there's going to be a landfalling hurricane? What can we do before it strikes?
And that was indeed a radar shot, John,
yes.
Not a satellite.
Yeah.
Well, what we can do, we need to be very careful as an individual, as a family, as a community to have a plan. Now, you need to know something about what the hurricane history of your area has been. And if you're at a low elevation, then you might have to think in terms of evacuating.
Yes.
Now, if you're going to do that, if you think you might have to do that, you need a plan to know where it is you're going to go. I think most people would be better off if they would try to get inland, perhaps to call on some friends or relatives. And of course, failing to do that, there will be shelters open. But now, if you're not next to the water, then what you have to worry most about is the wind, and you have to be prepared to deal with that. You should board up your house and so on, have supplies, and you might take a look at the trees around your house too, because one thing that we've noticed, if you're not near the water
And most of the residential damage that we see in a hurricane is caused when trees actually fall on houses or fall on wires or something like that. And you need to remember that the electricity is likely to be cut off. You need a battery-operated radio and all kinds of supplies to cook food without any power.
A lot of forethought and a lot of common sense.
Indeed.
Yes. We've got a call waiting right now from Greenville, South Carolina. Go right ahead, please.
I'd like to ask if we had a major hurricane hit Hilton Head Island, what could the possibilities of storm surge be for Hilton Head Island?
Now, the possibility would be very great indeed. Fortunately, we haven't had or seen very many major hurricanes hit Hilton Head Island. We had one that hit there, though, in August of 1893, and that island was just about inundated. I don't think there were very many areas of Hilton Head that were not covered with water, and there were a large number of fatalities there. So it is possible. It isn't likely, but if you get a major hurricane, you can have a tremendous storm surge at Hilton Head.
It's just kind of sitting there right there at sea level.
And it makes a big difference there, I might say, whether it comes in on high tide or not, because the tidal range at Hilton Head between high and low tide is pretty great. It can be as much as 6 or 8 feet difference on spring tide. So the whole situation there depends on whether it comes in on high or low tide also.
All right. We have a call waiting from Brownsville, Texas. Go right ahead, Texas.
Yes, hello. I would like to ask you, when the last hurricane hit Corpus Christi? Which year?
I think the last
that you had.
The last one of any consequence, I think, was Hurricane Celia, and that was 1970, and that was a major hurricane. Did a lot of damage at Corpus Christi.
All right. Let's send on down to Florida, this time to Pensacola. Go right ahead, please.
Yes, my question is, would you say that the heat wave and the drought that we've been experiencing here in the United States have an effect on how many hurricanes develop or how many hurricanes will hit the United States?
Any correlation there?
And that's an excellent question, and about the only thing we have to go by is what our experience has been in the past. Now, if we look at the drought years in the 1930s, which were the worst we ever had in this country, we had above normal hurricanes every year, and quite a few hit the United States. We also had a drought in the 50s where that was also true. We had a lot of landfalling hurricanes. Now, the one thing that doesn't seem to correlate with a large number of hurricanes is to have a drought in the southeast, such as we've had for part of this year. But definitely, if the drought is in the Midwest or in the Northeast, those years tend to have more storms than normal.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
Yes. Let's take a call now from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Go ahead with your question, please.
Yes, John?
Yes, both of us.
Yes, I got an important question for you. Why do tropical waves form over near the west coast of Africa? And my second question is, do you think if a hurricane would form over the east coast, would it break down the dome of high pressure there?
Well, the waves that we see coming off Africa they're pretty stormy situations across Africa. They come all the way across Africa, all the way from the Horn of Africa to the Bulge. This year they have been particularly strong. And not only that, they've had quite a lot of rain with them. You know, Africa's been suffering this severe drought for a long time. And during that same period of years, there have been fewer hurricanes than normal in the Atlantic. This year, the drought seems to be broken over there, too. And we suspect that this might be another factor that leads to more storms than usual over some parts of the Atlantic.
Yes. He was also wondering of the occurrence of a hurricane off the east coast affecting the high-pressure dome.
Oh, yes. Well, a hurricane doesn't affect the high-pressure dome as much as the high-pressure dome affects the hurricane, I don't think, because hurricanes tend to steer around the periphery of these big highs. But indeed, if you did get a hurricane from up the east coast, you wouldn't have any high-pressure dome left up there, that's for sure.
Makes sense to me, yes. When we come back, we'll take an official look at the tropics, tell you what's going on there today. As we continue with John Hope on hurricanes, our toll-free number is 1-800-541-6056.
No matter what anyone tells you, the Wall Street Journal cannot make you a success overnight. Which is why we suggest a 13-week subscription.
Call 800-626-8500 for this great journal subscription offer. 13 weeks for just $29.75 with a money-back guarantee. 13 weeks, $29.75. Phone 800-626-8500 now for the Wall Street Journal.
As anyone who reads the Wall Street Journal can tell you, It takes money to make money. Specifically, it takes 47 cents a day.
Call 800-626-8500 for this great journal subscription offer. 13 weeks for just $29.75 with a money-back guarantee. 13 weeks, $29.75. Phone 800-626-8500 now for the Wall Street Journal.
The 36-hour forecast. Stay tuned for the latest weather information here on the Weather Channel.
Welcome back to John Hope on Hurricanes. I'm John Doyle. This is John Hope. John will be taking some more of your questions very shortly. Right now, let's take a detailed look at the tropics with Dennis Smith.
Thank you very much, John. As we examine on this 21st day of August, a tropical depression sitting right off the coast of Africa, another one east-southeast of Jamaica, a strong tropical wave in the central Atlantic, and we're also monitoring the area in the Pacific for any possible development. We're keeping a close eye on the tropics all around through the season. In fact, let's take a look at the tropical depression that's sitting right here. Here's the west coast of Africa. It's located about 60 miles to the southeast of the Cape Verde Islands. It continues to move on off towards the northwest at about 5 miles an hour. Winds are clocked at about 30 miles an hour. We'll continue to monitor that feature as it continues to drift on off towards the northwest. It's not expected to see any major increase or strengthening over the next 24 to 48 hours. Meanwhile, we're looking at a tropical wave that's still sitting in the central Atlantic. It's towards the northeast of the Lesser Antilles. We'll continue to move off towards the northwest. A fairly strong tropical wave warrants keeping a very close eye on as it continues to move on off towards the northwest. Closer to home, we have a tropical depression. It's in a position about 700 miles east-southeast of Kingston, Jamaica. Kingston's sitting right about here, and we can see it's about 700 miles east-southeast of Kingston, continuing to pull on off towards the west-northwest at 17. That's kind of quick, and winds are about 30 miles an hour. Because of its rapid west-northwest movement, we're not expecting to see any major strengthening over the next 24 hours. However, a lot of warm water to splash around in the Caribbean. So if it does continue to hold together by the time it moves into the central or even the southern Caribbean area, we could see something a little bit more interesting. We will keep a very close eye on it. Here's what we see farther on out through the Caribbean into the Lesser Antilles. Let's go ahead and put this area into motion for you. Show you how that depression has shown most of its convection right in here today and now drifting on off towards the north and east portion of that depression. Not too impressive. In fact, weakening a little bit over the last 3 or 4 hours. But again, since it's be tracking in this general vicinity, we'll have to keep a very close eye on it for the next couple of days. It'll be moving into some very warm water as we track in towards midweek. Also, we can examine the area in the Gulf of Mexico and find out we have lots of showers and thunderstorms still building along the Gulf of Mexico area, but not showing up with any tropical features there, as well as in the western Gulf moving in towards Mexico. Those showers and thunderstorms continue to drift on off towards the west. Now, to give you more of your questions answered, we'll take it back to John and John.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, of course, with the reconnaissance near San Juan, maybe we'll have a report on that storm or what it actually is within the next 24 hours.
The reconnaissance plane is on the way there right now. It should be there within the hour.
And, of course, you have your eye on that disturbance in the mid-Atlantic.
Yes, I do.
Right. We've got some calls waiting, and our first one is from New Orleans, Louisiana. Go right ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to know what the most dangerous part of the storm is. Is it before or after the eye passes over?
I believe that it's fair to say that they're both equally dangerous. The winds increase as the eye approaches, all right? And then when the eye gets there, you have your calm, and then what happens is that the wind resumes with equal violence, I would say, from the opposite direction. So both situations are very dangerous. Now, in a hurricane, you know, a lot of people have gone out in the eye of the hurricane. They've experienced this tremendous wind and all this noise and for a period of hours, and then when the calm comes there, you tend to go outside and to see what happens. And sometimes they get too far away, so that's a very dangerous part of the hurricane. Usually the storm surge, it depends on exactly where you are. The storm surge, the worst might be just as the eye gets there, but there's some situations where if you have a bay or something like that, the surge could come in after the eye passes.
Oh my. So it really depends on where the eye is and where you are relative to it.
The eye wall, that's that donut-shaped ring right around the eye of the hurricane. That's a dangerous part no matter which side of it you have to be on.
All right, okay. Call next from Orlando, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. If you live in the center of the state of Florida, what's the possibility of the hurricane coming in either from the Gulf or from the Atlantic Ocean?
Thank you.
Well, if you live in Orlando, you can get a hurricane in from either direction. Now, fortunately for people living inland, the wind does diminish some, but Florida is a pretty narrow peninsula, and a major hurricane would maintain hurricane force all the way across the state.
Yeah.
Not quite so strong perhaps as on the coast, but could be strong enough to be devastating even right in the middle of the state.
Yeah, it's so flat, generally.
Because it's flat and it's narrow. It doesn't take very long sometimes for a hurricane to get there from either coast.
Exactly. Let's take a call from Charlotte, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, John. I'd like to know what causes the westward movement of those waves off of Africa, contrary to the movement of most weather systems in the northern hemisphere. I don't understand what causes them to move west instead of off to the east.
Thank you.
Well, everything in the deep tropics moves toward the west. Now, the reason that happens is that all these disturbances, waves, hurricanes, or whatever, are really steered by the current around them. And in the Atlantic, what it is the Azores-Bermuda High, which is very dominant over the Atlantic Ocean in the summertime. Now, to the south of that high, the winds blow from the east, and that moves the hurricane along from east to west, just like a cork in a stream. And by the time you get into the western part of the Atlantic, if the high doesn't extend out very far, then they come around the western end of the high, and they move then from south to north.
Yes.
And as they keep on getting farther north, then they begin to encounter the westerlies around the north side of the Azores-Bermuda High, and then the hurricane goes off to the northeast.
And then when it sits out the shore here, its movement is very erratic. Is it controlled by those wind systems at that point?
It is indeed, but sometimes there's kind of a transformation from one system to another. Our success in forecasting where a hurricane is going to go depends pretty much on our being able to forecast what the orientation and the configuration of the high pressure areas around it are going to be.
Yeah, so much goes into it.
It does.
Amazing. Go to the great Midwest and call from Lincoln, Nebraska. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I know this is a long distance away from hurricanes now, but I was raised in Boston, Massachusetts. And in 1938 or 39, I'm not sure which, John, we had the eye pass over Boston in that hurricane. And I was wondering if you'd ever been in one and what the effect was to you. To me, it was so still, like you said just a moment ago. We went outside and the birds weren't even singing yet. They didn't even commence singing when the eye went over. And it was so quiet. It was just immensely quiet. And then when the hurricane wind started coming again, then we get back in the house. But it was quite an experience, and I wondered if you'd ever experienced it.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say that this is the 50th anniversary of that hurricane. This is the worst hurricane that's ever hit New England, certainly in modern times. It was in September 1938. And yes, I've experienced two hurricanes, neither one I'm quite as strong as that. I was in Miami for Hurricane Cleo in 1964. Now, that wasn't quite as strong, but the eye of Hurricane Cleo came right up Biscayne Boulevard.
Oh.
Now, that was in 64. In 65, the Hurricane Betsy, the eye came a little bit south. That was a stronger hurricane, but we, at our house, we certainly had sustained hurricane force winds for some time on each one of them.
That's close enough.
It was.
Close enough. We'll take some more calls from you in just a moment. Our toll-free number, 1-800-541-6056, as we continue with John Hope on hurricanes.
Inside every family across the USA, there's one person responsible for making ends meet. She's sharp of mind, sharp of pencil.
Harold, I sure hope you're renting from Budget Rent-A-Car this vacation.
Already done.
I'm sure glad we married you.
Who didn't move, Daddy?
Leisure travelers find great car rental values by moving to Budget for some very personal reasons. When making reservations, ask for the special Weather Channel rate.
36-hour forecast. Stay tuned for the latest weather information here on the Weather Channel.
We're glad you joined us tonight on the Weather Channel for a very special John Hope on hurricanes. I'm John Doyle. We're taking your calls and questions about hurricanes at 1-800-541-6056. A little earlier, we saw that hurricanes, of course, can cause an extreme amount of damage, but, John, they can be killers, too, can't they?
They can. The worst tragedy we ever had in this country, of course, was the Galveston natural tragedy. 6,000 people were killed there, and 2,000 off the Carolinas in the 1893 hurricane. And at the same time, they do an awful lot of damage, and we've been pretty pleased if we look at the damage over the years, and here's a graph that shows these are for 5-year periods, and if we examine how much damage was done to property, we find that this has generally been increasing most of the time, although in the last 5-year period it went down a bit. At the same time, the fatalities have decreased. Now, we'd like to flatter ourselves that this is because the detection is so much better and the tracking is better, but I'm not sure that's the case. I think we've been a little bit lucky, and especially in recent years. Now, we've had, since 1969, since Hurricane Camille, we've had fewer hurricanes, really bad hurricanes than normal. Now, the total number hasn't been that much different, but for example, in Category 4 or higher hurricanes, records between 1900 and 1960 would indicate that we would have one of these every 5 years. We've only had one in the last 25 years, and that was Hurricane Camille itself in 1969, which was a Category 5.
Well, now, how close a call did we have with Gloria coming up that east coast? You had some dramatic graphic pictures of high tide and low tide differences there.
Well, Hurricane Gloria was a little bit like the 1938 hurricane. At one point, when it was along the east coast, it was as strong as Gloria ever was. Now, it did weaken some as it went up the east coast, but the big difference, and I hope that everybody understands this, that the 1938 hurricane came in on high tide, and Gloria came in on low tide, and that made all the difference in the world.
All right. Thank you, John. We'll take a call right now from Santa Rosa, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I'm calling because my mom just moved to the Houston area, and I was wondering about the hurricane history for that area and what would be the main damage caused by the winds or flooding. Thanks.
Which may be worse.
Well, I can't begin to list all the hurricanes, but the Houston area around the bay there is very vulnerable to hurricane storm surge because it's a low elevation, and not only that, but the ground has been subsiding some. Now, I can't go into all the history of hurricanes in the Houston area, but of course we had the Galveston hurricane in 1900, which we have mentioned, and then there was another major hurricane there about 1915, and there have been many in between, but up in more modern times we had Hurricane Carla, which was a major hurricane in 1961. And then as recently as 1983, we had Hurricane Alicia.
We have a call now from New Jersey. Go right ahead, please.
Hi, John. I was wondering how many hurricanes have been in the Atlantic Ocean at one time, and how many do you feel will come up the Atlantic coast this year?
I think that one time in the 1950s, I've forgotten exactly what year it was, I think it was 1957 maybe, that we had 5 hurricanes, full hurricanes on the map in the Atlantic all at one time.
Had a gang of them all at once, didn't we? Yeah.
Well, as far as how many are coming up the East Coast, this would be pure speculation. We hope there won't be any, but we've been in a kind of a cycle where there have been fewer East Coast hurricanes over the last 20 years, and that we had in the decade of the 50s, just about every hurricane we had wanted to go up there. And we had one in 1938. In 1944, a hurricane went up the East Coast. So I wouldn't be able to say how many, but if I lived on the East Coast between now and the end of September, I'd want to be ready for one.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the traditional storm tracks that the storms have taken over the years off the Atlantic coast.
Well, if we look at the storm tracks, if we look into August, we see that we're just getting into the Cape Verde season, and that means that they could develop out there where we have that depression right now, as a matter of fact. And then as we get into September, we still are subject to getting the Cape Verde type of hurricanes, but as we get later on to the season in October, then the area of origin goes back in pretty much into the Caribbean Sea.
All right. John, we'll be back with some more questions from our viewers. The toll-free number is 1-800-541-6056 as we continue with John Hope on hurricanes.
It's time to renew our environmental commitments. The greenhouse effect, the destruction of the ozone layer, acid rain are no longer just theoretical possibilities. They are immediate threats to all of us.
Our world is changing, and the changes that are happening to our planet Earth may change the way we live sooner than we ever imagined.
And that's not in the lives of our grandchildren or our children. That's in our lives.
On Sunday, August 28th, a special 90-minute presentation on the Weather Channel helps you understand the environmental forces shaping a new world. The greenhouse effect, acid rain, the diminishing ozone layer.
What's being done to preserve a habitable Earth? Is there still time to reverse the destruction? What can you do to make a difference?
Phone in your questions to a panel of experts when we consider the global crisis. Sunday, August 28th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on the Weather Channel.
Programming of the Weather Channel is protected under the copyright laws of the United States and is intended solely for the use of our subscribers. Reproduction or other use of this programming without the express written permission of the network is prohibited.
The current conditions. The 36-hour forecast. Stay tuned for the latest weather information here on the Weather Channel.
Tonight, John Hope is answering your questions all about hurricanes. I'm John Doyle, and John, we have a question waiting for us from Spartanburg, South Carolina. Go right ahead, please.
Thank you. I would like to know if a hurricane will cross a front.
Short and sweet.
The answer could be short, too. The answer is no. But the reason it can't do that is that hurricane depends very much on warm air. If you go across the front, then you get into colder air, and it would immediately begin to dissipate. Now, what a hurricane will do a lot of times, it will approach the front, and if it comes up from the south, and the front might kind of give way. But once you get cold air from the poleward side of the front into circulation, at that point, the hurricane should begin to diminish.
It's got to have that warm air to drive it, doesn't it?
It does, and maintain it.
Okay, let's take a call from Girard, Ohio, please.
Hi.
Yes.
I was wondering, why is the eye of the storm so calm?
Well, the eye is calm because this air that's being spiraled in there, this pulls in air from the surrounding ocean, and it moves faster and faster as it goes into this vortex, and and spins. Now the air, this fast-moving air, doesn't actually ever get into the center of the eye. It's like you have in your kitchen sink. If you see water running down the sink, you see the water spiraling real fast around the outside, not down the middle. Hurricane's the same principle, except it goes up instead of down.
There was a reconnaissance project, Storm Fury, some years ago that kind of dealt with that circulation and an attempt to modify the storms, wasn't it?
The purpose of Storm Fury was a project that was an experiment to see if the highest winds in a hurricane could be modified. And what they were trying to do is to see outside the eye wall and make the eye expand because of the conservation of momentum. It's like a skater. When they pull in their arms, they'll spin faster. And the theory was that if they could expand this eye a little bit, then they might be able to diminish the hurricane. This was a very expensive project, though, because they had to have a lot of aircraft out there to monitor that, and that was really written out of the federal budget in the early 1970s.
Well, aside from expense, it seemed perhaps there's some inherent danger on playing around with that.
Well, there might be a little danger. People were very concerned about it, so they had all kinds of ground rules that they couldn't seed a hurricane if it was within 48 hours of landfall, for example. And the reason for that was they didn't want to go out there, seed a hurricane, and then have it of its own accord increase and maybe come in and destroy a city. And they didn't want that to happen, so it was very difficult to find a suitable candidate to seed.
Yes, there you are. Let's take a call from Greenville, South Carolina again. Go ahead, please.
Hello, John.
Yes.
My question is it true that hurricanes release heat from the earth?
Release heat.
Well, a hurricane is, of course, the circulation of a hurricane absorbs a lot of heat from the ocean itself, and that's where it gets its energy. It's the warm ocean water that's the fuel that supplies the hurricane. But we believe that a hurricane is also a mechanism to transport heat from the tropics to the polar regions. And some sort of thing like a hurricane is very likely necessary to do that, because in the polar regions, the Earth radiates more heat than it holds, and in the tropics it's just the opposite. They have an excess of heat. So a hurricane is a mechanism to distribute some of this excess heat from the tropics to the higher latitudes.
As we take a look at our tropical season this year so far, where do we focus our attention now?
Well, we need to focus our attention these next few weeks because we are approaching the heart of the hurricane season. Traditionally, most of the severe hurricanes that have hit the United States have hit sometime in August or September. We've had very few Category 4s, say, that hit earlier. Audrey in 1957 that hit in Louisiana was a June hurricane, but that doesn't very often happen. So we need to be paying attention to what goes on out there. And as these depressions develop and increase the storms of hurricanes, we need to know where they're going. And if they're headed in your direction, you need to take whatever action that's appropriate for you to take.
Exactly. John, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
You're welcome.
Always great to hear it from the expert. And of course, John will be monitoring the tropics all the way through the hurricane season, and you can see him Monday through Friday here on the Weather Channel. Next Sunday at 6:30, it's Global Crisis, an in-depth look at the environment and the damage that man has caused. Be sure to join us then. And by the way, your response to these programs has been overwhelming, so you can expect to see more of that in the future. For now, for John Hope, I'm John Doyle. Thank you for watching, and good night.
The 36-hour forecast. Five-day forecast. tuned. More weather updates here on the Weather Channel.
And now it's time for the Michelin Drivers Report. Michelin, because so much is riding on your tires. And in the southwest, believe it or not, there's some rain and plenty of it. Of course, the monsoon season is in effect, and we have a little extra tropical moisture flowing on up into the region. Doesn't take much rain to cause flooding, and that's what we've had. Parts of Southern California around the Phoenix metro area where it's been raining on and off all day. Some thunderstorms, well, we have them ahead of a front throughout the upper Midwest from Minnesota down toward Nebraska. Some of these storms could be very heavy at times with gusty winds and hail. General thunderstorms in the southeast as well as the southwest. Severe thunderstorm watch in effect until 8 p.m. Central Daylight Time for the area shaded in yellow, and that includes parts of the North Dakota area on up toward Bemidji in Minnesota. Quite a bit of wind gusts in excess of 30 miles per hour.
He's riddled. Hey, Mom, what do you get when you